Hey everyone, Jared Sechel here with PragerU Live. I am very happy to have with us today Dr. Michael Oren. He is a member of Israel's Knesset, Israel's Deputy Minister for Diplomacy, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, author of 6 Days of War and Ally, both excellent books that I highly recommend. And we're having him on today because, one, today is Yom Yerushalayim, which is Jerusalem Day, and because President Trump just left Israel on what was a very important trip. So we want to talk with Dr. Oren about that. Dr. Oren, thank you so much for joining us.
Delightful to be with you, Jared.
So first question, for everyone watching, can you explain the significance of Jerusalem Day to Israelis?
It's the day in which we reunited with our ancient capital. I don't know if there's another people in the world that has a relationship with the city as the Jewish people have with the city of Jerusalem. We have been faithful to this city. We have loved this city for more than 3,000 years. It's mentioned some 683 times in our Bible. We have longed for it. We pray in its direction. And between 1948 and 1967, after the creation of the State of Israel, the first 19 years of Israel's creation, that city was divided. It was divided by barbed wire, by mines, and an actual wall over which Arab snipers regularly picked off Israeli civilians on the western half of the city. And that wall denied the right of the Jewish people to visit their holiest sites, almost all of which were on the eastern side of the city. Above all, the Western Wall, as well as the Mount of Olives cemetery, which is the oldest and most sacred of Jewish cemeteries in the world. And so Jerusalem Day marks the anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem by Israeli paratroopers on June 7th, 1967, now nearly 50 years ago. So this Jerusalem Day is especially cherished by us and celebrated by us. As I'm speaking to you now, thousands of Israelis, Jews from around the world, our supporters, many of them non-Jews from around the world, are marching and celebrating the streets of Jerusalem.
How did the reunification of Jerusalem and the 6-Day War in general change Israel's position in regards to Egypt, to Jordan, to Syria, and also to the Palestinians?
Well, the subtitle of the book is June 1967 and the Making of the Modern Middle East. And you really can't understand the Middle East without understanding the 6-Day War. It was not only the reunification of the Jewish people with Jerusalem, but it was the reunification of the state of Israel with the land of Israel. Haifa is not in the Bible, but Jericho is, Bethlehem, Hebron. These are cities in Judea and Samaria, what the world calls the West Bank. And that reunification created a tremendous infusion of Jewish identity, both in Israel, in the United States. I remember very well growing up in America, in the Soviet Union, where 3 million Soviet Jews were languishing under Soviet and communist oppression. The Soviet Jewry movement began in 1967, and that movement would ultimately help bring down the Soviet Union. And the immigration of nearly 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union would transform Israeli society almost unrecognizably, making Israel into the innovative giant that it is today. Israel nearly quadrupled the size of the territory under its control in those 6 fateful days in June 1967. And in November 1967, the UN passed Resolution 242, which guaranteed 2 things: secure and recognized borders for all states in the Middle East, but also the principle of territory for peace. And by giving territory back to Egypt that Israel had captured in the 6-Day War, Israel got peace with Egypt. And by getting peace with Egypt, Israel got peace with Jordan. And those 2 peace arrangements have been transformative, not just for Israel, but for much of this corner of the Middle East. The 6-Day War, Israel fought it mostly with French arms. The French were Israel's only allies at the time. The French switched sides the night before the war. The United States was a friendly country, but not an allied country. And it was only in the aftermath of Israel's astonishing victory in 1967 that American policymakers sort of woke up and determined that and realized that there was a pro-American democratic powerhouse in the Middle East that just defeated several Soviet-armed armies, and the United States decided to make an alliance with that country. And thus was born what is today probably the deepest and most multifaceted strategic alliance that the United States has with any foreign country. So right there, all of that was immensely transformative. One of the greatest transformations, strangely enough, was with the Palestinians. Before '67, the West Bank was under annexation, had been annexed by Jordan. It was the Gaza Strip was occupied by the Egyptian military. Nobody was talking about a Palestinian state. Nobody was talking about the Palestinians at all. And it was the Six-Day War that brought the three major populations of the Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in Israel together. And the defeat of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the great leader of the Pan-Arabist movement in '67, forced the Palestinians to look to themselves. And that's where you see the rise of the Palestine Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat. It really didn't exist in that form before the war. And you see the Palestinian issue come to the fore. So everything we've seen almost this week, we're going to talk about the Trump visit, I understand later, a visit by the President of the United States to Israel. No president had ever been to Israel before '67. No Israeli prime minister had ever been to the White House before 1967. Nobody was talking about the Palestinian issue. The notion that Arabs could make peace with Israel. Here, President Trump has flown from Saudi Arabia directly to Israel. He couldn't have done that unless there were long-standing peace arrangements already between Israel and Arab countries, between Israel and Egypt and Jordan. So much can be traced back to those 6 days in June 1967.
Well, and to follow up on that, and to bring it from '67 to right now, 2017. What's your takeaway of President Trump's visit to Israel? Was it encouraging?
It was a very powerful and a very moving visit. He spoke often of his love for Israel, his love for Jerusalem. His visit was probably as significant as much for what he didn't say as what he did say. He did not lock Israel and the Palestinians and the Arab world into a formula. And by doing so, he corrected a mistake that has been made repeatedly over the last 15 years of saying basically what the outcome of negotiations would be, a two-state situation with the border being more or less on the 1967 lines. If you're a Palestinian listening to that again and again, you know what the outcome of the negotiations are going to be. Why go into negotiations? Why make concessions if the world's already given you everything up front? President Trump doesn't come from the world of diplomacy, from policy. He comes from the world of business. And he knows that in business negotiations, two businessmen sit around a table. They don't know what the outcome of the negotiations are going to be. That's not the way it works in business. And I think that he's applying that model to the Middle East. As someone involved in this process, I find it very refreshing. I think that the absence of a very specific formula that locks everybody in and basically takes away incentive for parties to negotiate creates a tremendous amount of space for Israelis, for Palestinians, and for Sunni Arab states, who I think now will have a crucial, if not pivotal, role in the peace process.
What's the general feeling in Israel when it comes to U.S.-Israeli relations now versus what they were under President Obama?
I think we've turned a corner. My previous book was called Ally. It was about my time in Washington, and it was a trying period. The previous administration, I believed, and not just I believe, tended to view Israel as part of the problem, not part of the solution, and often did not treat Israeli leaders as one in ways that were befitting the leaders of an allied democracy. Not only the only democracy in the world, in the Middle East, but one of the few countries in the world, really one of a handful, that has never known a second of non-democratic governance, and which is unabashedly, unreservedly pro-American. I think we deserve better treatment than we got. Having said that, this administration, very different approach. I've been in the White House. It's a different atmosphere. We may still have some differences of opinion on how to move forward on the peace process, but I think on overall, the approach is immensely positive. And on one issue especially, there has been really a 180-degree turn, and that is the issue of Iran. The previous administration viewed Iran as part of the solution and not the problem. And this administration and this president has come out again and again and said unequivocally, publicly, that Iran is the greatest threat to Middle Eastern stability. Iran is the largest state sponsor of terror, and Iran must never, ever, ever get a nuclear weapon.
Would you like to see President Trump tear up the nuclear deal, enforce it strictly, or do something else?
Well, I can't get into those details. That's a conversation that is held on an intimate level between Prime Minister and President. But what I can say is this. The nuclear deal completely ignores Iranian behavior. Iran can be the largest state sponsor of terror. It can be complicit in the massacre of 500,000 Syrians. It can be attacking in Iraq. It can be attacking in Yemen. Its leaders can openly deny the Holocaust and declare their goal of destroying the state of Israel, a genocidal policy. None of that impacted the nuclear deal. And establishing that connection is absolutely vital for Israel. Moreover, this nuclear deal will expire. In another decade or so, Iran will have the infrastructure, it'll have the legitimacy to enrich enough uranium to make not one, but many, many bombs. And by all estimates, the same regime, if not even a worse regime, will still be in power in Tehran. We, together with the United States and our neighboring countries, neighboring Arab countries that now view Israel not as a threat, not as an enemy, but as an ally, together we have to begin to grapple with that looming ominous challenge of a nuclear-armed Iran.
Looking bigger picture, what needs to happen, if anything can happen, for there to be a peace between the Palestinians and Israel the way there is between the Jordanians and the Egyptians in Israel?
Well, it depends how you define peace. Egypt is a country that's been around for some 5,000 years. It's a nation state. Jordan is a monarchy that traces its roots back to the Prophet Muhammad. It has legitimacy. What we've seen in the Middle East is the failure of nation states whose borders were drawn by Europeans 100 years ago, with identities that were apportioned to them by Europeans 100 years ago. We've seen Syria unravel, Iraq unravel. The last thing this area needs is another failed nation state. And it is very important as we move towards some type of arrangement with the Palestinians that we keep that in mind. We should recall that even this state was 60 years in the creation, from 1882 to 1948. And Israelis and Zionists built the institutions on which a stable nation state could arise. Those institutions do not exist in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. And I think if there were a Palestinian nation state created tomorrow, it would fall apart within days, maybe even within hours, to Hamas at best, to ISIS at worst, and threaten every state in this region. So we should move forward, and we should provide the Palestinians with the maximum amount of autonomy, prosperity, freedom of movement, freedom of expression. I mean, right now, they could hold elections, but they themselves don't want to hold elections. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, hasn't been reelected in 10 years. He hasn't stood for elections because he'll know he'll lose to Hamas. And we should provide for better life for Palestinians as for Israelis, working again in close cooperation with those Sunni Arab states who want to see a more stable and better Middle East, laying the groundwork for someday more permanent and formal arrangement.
Dr. Oren, thank you so much for joining us, and Happy Jerusalem Day.
Thank you. Happy Jerusalem Day to you too. Always a pleasure.
Thank
you. Be well.
You too.